I see Jerry Ray is not here, but before I get any further, I want to amend something that I said Wednesday night, and I'll see him personally when he's here. But he brought up a comment or a question, I can't remember the exact wording of it, about the anti-pope, and I kind of pled ignorance to that, didn't know what he was talking about. Well, he's absolutely right. That is, I found out, a term that was applied to this period of time when there was actually two popes ruling from different places at the same time, which we haven't fully got to that yet, but I wanted to make that known right now that he was absolutely right. That is not a Bible term, don't get me wrong, it's a history term that you can find that was used to refer to those competing popes. Okay, we were on page 11, if you've got your notes handy, toward the bottom of it when we ended Wednesday night's class, and we were concluding the comments about the great schism that occurred in the church, Eastern Orthodox Church versus the Western Roman Church, how that they had fought for centuries over who had the preeminence, the Bishop of Rome, the Pope, versus the patriarchs that were sharing leadership in the Eastern Church, and various things that caused them to be at odds with one another until it finally boiled over, and we had the Holy Roman Emperor Henry III appointing the next new Pope of the West, Leo IX, and that really set the tensions off when an emissary from the Pope is actually in Easter Sunday services in the Constantinople Cathedral, the Hagia Sophia. Y'all ought to look that up. It's an interesting building that Constantine funded the money to build it, and it even became a Muslim mosque when the Turks took over Constantinople. It's been both a Christian and a Muslim church. I think it still stands today, to this day. It's a kind of a wonder of the world place. Anyway, it was during that service that the Pope excommunicates the leader of the Byzantine church right there in the middle of services. I can picture that. And but anyway, that's about where we had ended. We haven't yet, but we will talk a little bit about the Crusades. And for the point being that, you know, when this great schism occurred, it did not help at all in a few years later that Western soldiers looted and plundered Constantinople on their way to fight the infidel Muslims down in the Holy Lands. They came through Constantinople. We'll look into that. And again, in the Fourth Crusade, there was another episode of soldiers, you know, breaking into churches, palaces, private homes, businesses, and just ransacking the place. Of course, these were uncontrolled soldiers, if you will, doing what soldiers sometimes do. But that happened in Constantinople. Any comments or questions before we take off in a trot? We need to move on.
When did they start calling the Catholic Church the Catholic Church?
Oh, way back. And the word Catholic in Latin, it really just means universal. So you could use the word Catholic in non-religious terms and be absolutely correct. But the term was, firmly established. I couldn't tell you the exact first time it was used. If you recall back, we looked at Ignatius of Antioch, some of his writings, his early departures from the truth about the oversight of the church being among elders, and he had mentioned just the bishop. You remember Ignatius? I don't know how reliable it is to say that those ancient letters that he wrote have been passed down and translated into other languages and copied by people that had a bias for the Catholic Church. But if I'm not mistaken, the word Catholic is actually used in those letters. Now that may have been, like I say, piddled with by monks that were copying those old ancient letters that they had and put a little extra in there to make the Catholic Church look better, but it still stands that Ignatius wrote about to these ancient churches that, you know, they should obey the bishop who was, you know, as Christ, and he separated.
These bishops kept getting and set up a higher bishop and then a
Oh,
higher
yeah.
bishop
Oh,
till
yeah.
they got to the Pope, and then
Oh, yeah.
next thing you know, they start calling it the Catholic Church, so I didn't know what
It goes way back.
when they actually
Yeah,
started
same,
saying, this is it.
we could, yeah, we could have the same discussion about who's the first pope. Well, you get all kinds of answers who that was, you know, all the way from the first pope was Peter, which basically they wouldn't anybody disagree with that, but as far as when the first bishop of Rome started calling himself the pope and all that, it varies, but by the times that we're talking about now, they are really starting to get up ahead of steam, if you will, to being very powerful. Very, very powerful. And folks, think about this just a second, what we're talking about here. You know, how old is the United States this year? 250 years. Well, how could I, 1,000 years from now, lecture some crowd about the history of the United States in 2 or 3 paragraphs? Think of all the changes, you know, from basically a poor bunch of colonies revolting and an agricultural society until it's become the great urbanized society, and think of all the cultural changes that's happened in just 250. We're talking about 1,000 years of history here of many, many countries, not just one, in Europe, and all the wars and all cultural changes. It's impossible task to do, but if you have no knowledge of any of that and how the church was affected by it and how we came out of it, I mean, that's the whole point of this class in my little mind is well, we all know the old saying, those that fail to learn from history are destined to repeat it. Well, I kind of like Mark Twain's take on that statement. That's not a false statement entirely, but Mark Twain said it this way: history doesn't repeat itself, but it sure does rhyme. Okay? So, yeah, there's some profit to studying this stuff. We ain't been dusting off the Bible too much. I'm kind of leaving that to y'all. You know, we talk about some of these vices or these things that were going on in the church, and I'm kind of leaving that up to you to think, that doesn't sound like anything I ever read about the church in the New Testament. Well, y'all go look these things, yeah, study for yourself on, yeah, what is wrong with all this? It's pretty obvious, I think, and y'all are, you know, feel welcome to make comments or about that or questions, raise questions, but, you know, we can't get bogged down in every little detail of false theology and stuff and ever get anywhere in this study. So anyway, moving right along then. We're at the bottom of page 11 if you're following in the notes, and I've got the year 1073 to 1085. That's when Pope Gregory VII, he's known as Gregory the Great, and that may be one of the first popes that actually really got that title going to the papacy there in Rome, because he became very, very powerful, because, you know, for centuries the biggest power had been in the political government, the kings, the monarchs, the nobles, and yeah, the bishops in these big cities and all had become quite powerful in their own way in the church, but they didn't exercise great authority over the whole nation as such. That was, you know, nobles with their vast estates and wealth and in kings and such as that. And then, of course, the Holy Roman Empire came along after Charlemagne. He'll come out here in a second. And so power was controlled, real power in the governments, as divided and at war with each other as they were all the time. But here comes along Gregory the Great, and he frees the church from the powerful Holy Roman Empire and establishes a papal monarchy. And again, we're just brushing in one sentence over a bunch of history here, but how did he manage to do that, you might ask? Well, part of the reason comes down to the fact, if you look, the Holy Roman Emperor dies, and his successor is just a boy at the time. And there's his opportunity. Boy is a weak he's not going to be a powerful leader for a decade or more. And it's during that time that Gregory sees his chance, and in he comes. And he just starts passing all these edicts and papal authority, and he just basically takes over. And his idea is, and I've got a little statement that's why it's included here, popes are to kings as the sun is to the moon. The latter only reflects the true light from the source. In other words, in Gregory the Great's mind, I'm the sun, and these government leaders are just the moon. They're not emitting any light of their own. It's all coming from me, okay? That's the mindset of these church leaders now. I'm the sole authority in both spiritual and secular governing. And you kings and you emperors, you bow down and kiss my big toe, and you ask me if you're going to plan on going to war with some other nation. You ask me if your bishop dies and you need a new one in your cities. You ask me for everything. Okay, that's the way it is. All right, and I mean, how foreign is that to anything you read about the church of the New Testament, the way the apostolic church was left to us? It's mind-boggling, but that's the truth of the matter for centuries after this, for centuries. So, you know, some king gets out of line or some emperor makes him mad, he can just depose him, put in his own person. He has the power to do that. All right. Going right along with this power, and this just, I can't imagine, but the Pope, the church in Rome, levied taxes against empires, against nations, kings. All right. Not just the passing the collection plate in church and that money being, yeah, they were taking the tithing, if you will, or a big chunk of it. But no, they were levying taxes against governments. You paid an annual big chunk of money to the Roman church. Nations did. And the church becomes extremely wealthy. I mean, think about it. Think of those 800, they're 800 years old now, those Gothic cathedrals. St. Peter's in Rome and St. Paul's in London and all over France. Those, you know, some of those are still standing today. I think Notre Dame caught on fire, but they're rebuilding it, you know, in Paris. There were generations, several generations of craftsmen that their only job in their whole life and their kids and their grandkids, like if you were a carpenter, you worked on the cathedral for generations because those things took 100, 200 years to complete, some of them. Think of the money it took to hire all the building materials and the craftsmen and just day laborers to build those things. And that's just, you know, part of what the Catholic Church owned. And I'm not going to get into it much. It's an interesting, you might think, study, but the monastic lifestyle, the monks and the nuns, you know, taking vows of poverty, going off and living in a abbot somewhere in a monastery. Those monasteries and all the monks that lived in them were vast estates, often donated to them by rich European nobles who had blood on their hands to get wealthy and own vast land by killing other people. And so a lot of times they would just donate a chunk of their land to the church to build these monasteries. And thousands of monks went there as basically, you can just say they were free labor. They went there, took on a vow of poverty. They weren't paid, but they were workers. They were stonemasons. They were carpenters. They built these big monasteries. They kept cattle and sheep and flocks, and they raised vineyards, and they sold meat and milk and eggs and cheese and butter and wine, and they made books. They did all, and that was all sold, but it was generated by free labor, folks. It was a money-making machine to the Catholic Church. You know, and I'm not getting more into all that, but it's a whole different. It's estimated that the Catholic Church owned 20% of the real estate in England when Henry VIII threw them out of town, and we'll get to that later. Think about owning 20% of Arkansas. You own it. That makes you bigger than the Waltons, all right? But that's the power. They are estimated to have owned 50% of the wealth of France. The whole nation of France, the church owned 50% of that money, that wealth. And we can't imagine being that powerful, but that's the mind you need to get into to understand any of this. It had become a huge bureaucracy, the church had. The bureaucracy that had salaried church officials. You had legal representation to both the church and the civil governments. You had people in the church that was their job, was to be the chancery, the legal representation in whatever things they needed to have. You had government nuncios, they were called. They're emissaries or ambassadors to take care of the dealings between church and state. So you had ambassadors of the church, nuncios, going to all the big cities of Europe and taking care of this, making sure everything's taken care of. It's salaried positions, lucrative positions, all right? You had people that were just the accountants and CPAs of the church, working the banking and money of the church. I mean, think about this wealth. It's huge. It's a huge bureaucracy to run the Catholic Church in the Middle Ages. How does it get that way? Well, it just happened, gradually, slowly, over the centuries. Comments or questions? Well, as they say, if you want to find the corruption or the crime, just follow the money. All right? And you could do that. You could say that. Follow the money. And the corruption came right along behind it. We're going to take a little sideline for a few minutes here and, excuse me, look a little bit about the Crusades. What was that all about? Well, as we talked about before, the rise of the Arab states, the Muslims, Islam in the 620s, 30s, according to their timeline, that's when it started with Muhammad, but they did spread rapidly through the Roman Empire, what was the Roman Empire. And at this time now, we're in 1095, the Muslims have been in control of the Holy Lands since I've got there 636, when they defeated the Byzantine, the Eastern Roman Empire's army. And now the Muslims have a caliphate. That's what they call their control, as a caliphate. That was still going on to this day. The ISIS thing in Mosul, that was a caliphate trying to establish itself. The Islamic State of Iran and Syria, ISIS. All right. Well, these are Muslims back then. They had a caliphate, and at the time, the head man of this caliphate was from Egypt, and he's pretty easygoing and could get along with him a little better in Jerusalem. And the Christians were taking pilgrimages at this time to the Holy Lands, a lot of them, and that's you could go there and be left alone as long as you didn't preach to the Muslims and try to convert anybody, or you didn't build a church there and you paid your taxes while you were there to the Muslims. But along came this man named Seljuk. All right, Seljuk in 270 takes over the caliphate, overseeing Jerusalem and the Holy Lands, and he started abusing and persecuting Jews and Christians. And this incited a religious fervor in all of Europe, the Catholic Church. We can't have these infidels persecuting our brethren as they're going on these pilgrimages to see the temple site and all the holy sites in the Palestine area. So this fervor takes hold, and we got to get an army up and go down there and show them who's boss. That's the Crusades, basically. And again, there's always money behind this. There's a lot of wealthy merchants that traded all over the Orient at this time, but when these Turks came in and became obstinate, their trade routes had kind of been shut down. So there's an economic reason for a lot of rich, wealthy merchants in Europe to want to go down there and whoop them so they can open up their trade routes again and make money, lots of money. So Urban II, the Pope, appeals to all the nobles of Europe to, conscript troops, raise armies. We're going to put them all together and march down there and run this guy out. So in 1095, this is getting all worked up. Even the Byzantine Emperor Alexis I, and remember we just talked about they've had a great split in 1054. This is 1095, so the wounds are still pretty fresh, but even they're trying to cooperate because it affects them more in the Eastern Empire than it does the West as far as the land being taken over. So how are you going to recruit an army? Well, here's a recruitment tactic. Urban promises anybody that'll serve in the army complete remission of sins and a reward in heaven for going to fight. All right? You put on the cross on your suit and on your armor. That's what the word crusade really comes from. Crux in Latin is cross, and the Crusaders had the cross on their shield and the red on their thing. That's the Crusaders. They showed the sign of the cross everywhere they went, basically. Well, and he even goes so far as say, you peasants and serfs that are, basically slaves the rest of your life to these lords you're working for, you get a get out of jail card free too. If you serve an army, you're emancipated from your lords. He's not going to come back and get you for that. You're set free if you'll fight in the army. So yeah, they get an army up. The first crusade begins then. It lasts about 4 years, and it came in 2 waves. The first wave was mostly these poorly trained peasants that stepped up to get out of, being slaves, basically. And they head off across Europe and down into toward Constantinople. But they weren't very well prepared. They didn't bring enough food and supply, and soon they're on the march and they're starving. And so they begin to pillage their way across Central Europe, and they can find a Jewish house or home. That's basically who they're going to steal it from. But it's just kind of like the Civil War in Arkansas. If you read the history of the Civil War, the Union Army came through Arkansas and basically got their supply lines cut off and were starving, and they subsisted on just going out in the countryside. And if you had a cow, you didn't in the morning. If you had any chickens, you didn't in the. That's how armies survived in times of crisis, and that's what the first wave of the Crusades did in Europe. But they finally make it to Constantinople, and as we mentioned, they plundered the churches and palaces and houses in Constantinople. And this is 20,000 people, poor soldiers. And in spite of that, the emperor, the Byzantine Emperor Alexis, he orders this army to wait for him for his troops and reinforcements to arrive, and then they'll go together and march on the Turks. Well, they don't wait. They march on ahead of him down to Nicaea, and basically the Turks slaughtered them all. Okay. And then the second wave came a little shorter, and there was probably 30,000 soldiers that were much better trained. They had, more military training and led by French noblemen. And when they get to Constantinople, they take an oath of allegiance to Alexis. I mean, the first wave had gone very poorly because they didn't listen to him. So they get together, and they are successful in taking over the cities of Nicaea, Antioch, and Jerusalem. All right. And of course, Antioch and Jerusalem were both former Byzantine cities that had a patriarch in them, huge churches with their patriarchs over them. So those are taken back from the Turks. And history reports that probably, and as you've all heard, history is written by the victors, okay? So these numbers, taken with a grain of salt, because they like to brag about it a lot of times, and that's what becomes history. But reported of this battle says that 70,000 Muslims and Jews were killed by the Crusaders, they'd behead some, or they would torture and burn others. Atrocities of all kinds. Women being stabbed and their babies smashed against or thrown over the walls of the city. There's a report that a bunch of Jews were herded into a synagogue and the doors locked and it was set afire. All right. So are those exaggerations? Probably, some of it, but nonetheless it was, what's the church doing raising armies and getting involved in wars and fighting like this in the name of God with the cross on their shields and on their chests? I mean, what a stain. But anyway, that's what was going on. And of course, once they conquered these cities, well, then these Frenchmen, who are Western Catholics, they decide not to leave right away. After all, we got to leave a standing army here to control things, and they built Western Catholic churches in Eastern lands. Well, that didn't go over just too hot, but nonetheless, that's what happened after the first crusade. That's another insult against the Eastern Church that, again, just keep driving that wedge between them. They're never going to get back together. All right. Rapidly, the Second Crusade was in 1147, so you can see it's about 50 years later. This time, 200,000 soldiers, mostly from France and Germany, get together and march down there, and the Turks pretty much have their way this time, beat them at all the battles pretty much. And it said, and they weren't fighting in the Holy Lands. This time they were in Asia Minor and Syria, further north and to the west. But nonetheless, those lands held by the Turks at this time. They estimate only 10% of that 200,000 ever returned home. So pretty nasty fighting and heavy casualties. Then after that defeat in 1187, the First Crusade had taken Jerusalem. Well, this guy Saladin retakes Jerusalem from the Christian and again places the Holy City under Muslim rule. So the Third Crusade now is necessary. And in 1189, just a couple of years after Jerusalem is reconquered, the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, and that Barbarossa means red beard. All right, so Frederick, the Holy Roman Emperor, and Richard the Lionhearted, he's King of England, and Philip of France, he's the King of France. They all get together gathering these armies, head to the Holy Lands. They fight battles for 2 years, and they kind of come to a truce. Neither side made much ground, and the truce was that both sides could access their holy cities and holy sites, but the Muslims still controlled Jerusalem as far as the rulers there. And then you got 1200, the Fourth Crusade. Pope Innocent III wants to take the Holy Lands back, but he knows that the overland route, if you think about a map, and I should have brought one out, a map of Europe, how far you'd have to march an army across Europe, down through Asia Minor, and then through Syria, and then you're finally down there at the Holy Lands where you want to fight. That's a hard way to go. So he decides the way to do this is to load them up on ships and get them to Egypt and conquer Egypt. And now you've got a staging area. You can just slip right up and get into the Holy Lands quickly. Well, this is a dumpster fire here. So that's the plan that Innocent III comes up with. And the ships that they're going to take the armies across the Mediterranean are these Venetian merchants that have shipping. And they show up with their plans to get on their boats, and the price that the Venetians put on getting passage is way too high. They can't afford it. Well, I tell you what we'll do, said the Venetians. We'll hire you as mercenaries to go over here a few miles to the east. There's this city and land. It's now Croatia, but it was called Zeta in that time, and they were trading competitors with them. Okay, they're in the trade business, and they thought, we'll just hire you to wipe out our competition, and that's what they do. Trouble was, these people at Zeta were also Catholic, so now you've got a Catholic army going over and annihilating a bunch of other Catholics. Well, so the Pope excommunicated all the crusaders for that, but later he kind of agrees that he'll absolve them of their sins if they'll just give back all the stolen loot that they took doing that. And of course, the Venetian merchants that incited all this, they don't return the booty that they got from the army going over there and beating Croatia over this deal. But anyway, that's done, and then the soldiers are loaded on the ships and transported to Constantinople. And that may not be the correct way to put that. The army may not have got on ships. I'm drawing a blank here, actually. But anyway, they do. I guess they did. Yeah, I've got it in my notes that way, don't I? I'm kind of losing my mind here. The soldiers that got back from beating the Croatians wound up in Constantinople, and I think the Venetians helped them in that. All right, probably did float them over there, but nonetheless. They went to Constantinople because by then the Turks had taken that city also from the Byzantine emperor. But this army, the Crusaders do defeat the Turks, run them out of Constantinople. And like in the First Crusade, well, they set up a Latin empire in Constantinople, the seat of the Byzantine Empire, but these soldiers, being from the West, they set up their government there because they took it over. And that lasted until 261. So over 60 years, the Western Empire ran Constantinople for a while. And of course, that didn't go well. And eventually, the Eastern Christians from Nicaea retake Constantinople and put the Byzantine government back in power. So that's kind of, by the end of the fourth, the latter crusades were pretty much doomed from the start, weak and ineffectual. There's actually, even if you read the history, 2 different times that just armies of children would be sent down there, and they didn't even make it to the the battlefields, but armies of children would go on crusades to, I guess, punch their ticket to heaven, I guess, is the whole mentality. I can't get my mind around that, but that happened. And one of the final attempts in 1267, they wanted to take Egypt. That plan failed, but now they load up on ships and go across the Mediterranean and land the army in North Africa and head overland to the east into Egypt. That was their plan, and take Egypt that way. And that failed. So the legacy of the Crusades, it just left a huge stain on the Roman Catholic Church. And to this day, Jews, Muslims, Eastern Orthodox, Christians, there's a lot of hard feelings and grudges about all that went on back in this period of time. Any comments or questions? All right. Yeah. What's the question? I'm sorry. Who runs them? Well, same people that ran them back here. This huge bureaucracy called the Vatican, and the Pope's the head of it. Yeah, that's who's got the power. How many Catholics are in the world today? 1.25, 1.5 billion. It's huge. Yep. All right. Lesson number 5. And this, excuse me. My voice ain't going to hold out today. The corruptions that we've already been looking at them, but the real corruption that infiltrated the Catholic Church in the late medieval times. We're talking about the 13, 14, 1500s, leading up to where I know all of you are just chomping at the bit to get in. When are we going to study about the Protestant Reformation? Well, let's lay the framework for why that was even able to happen when it did. And it goes back to this, is the corruption and the rot at the core of And I'm not talking about just the poor, illiterate church member going to his church and sitting there as the priest does the liturgy in Latin. He don't know anything. He's uneducated. But I'm talking about the corruption at the higher levels, the educated people in the clergy, and all that was going on at this time, 1300s, 1400s. It is so rotten that I can't even use the language in a public audience like this to discuss it with you. All right? It's horrendous what some of the popes and the cardinals and the bishops and stuff were engaging in during this time. And it couldn't be kept a secret with this many people doing this many rotten things, all right? So moral weaknesses. What was going on in the late medieval period? Simony. You know, in the New Testament, he saw with the laying on of the hands that gifts were imparted by the apostles, and he wanted that power, and he wanted to buy it. Okay, that's where the term simony comes from, buying your church office. Okay, you wanted to be in the chancery in Venice. There's an opening for that job. Well, it's going to cost you. You can buy that job. Well, how much is it going to cost you? Well, it varies. But that's simony. Working in church administration was a lucrative profession. And so you've got legates. Legates are the upper crust, if you will, of the church bureaucracy, those that fill the higher offices. Okay, the archbishops and their emissary, the Pope's emissaries and his legal advisors and blah blah. You know, legates. The chancery is the courts, the legal people, the lawyers, stuff that run the courts, the church courts, not civil courts. The church has its own courts. All right. Abbots are the head people over all these monasteries we're talking about. They were wealthy. Okay, huge. Of course, bishops and many other jobs had to be filled. And so if you were wealthy enough, you could obtain these jobs by bribing the right person, or just some of them are just out and out put up for bids. You know, job opening, who paid the most? You got it. So that was going on all over Europe in all these offices. And closely related to that was nepotism. Okay? I got my nephew in to fill in another position under me, or, you know, my cousin, my son. Nepotism, rampant. So it kind of came under the same heading as simony. You got in, then you could get your family in for a good job too. Then there was pluralism. Well, if one job is lucrative, holding two jobs was very lucrative. And so these people would buy two positions. And closely related to having two positions was, well, I don't have time enough to fulfill the duties of one, so I'm going to be absent from the job most of the time if I have two or three jobs. And one of them jobs I took might have been in the next county or the next state over a long way, so you see, so you hold these offices, maybe you didn't even reside there, and you just don't fulfill the duties. But to get around that, a lot of times these clerics that took these jobs would just hire a lackey to do it for them for a small percentage. You know, they're making $100,000 a year, and you're paying a guy $25,000 to do the work. That's a pretty good profit. Right? So that was the corruption going on in the clergy, and they were greedy. You know, they were siphoning off the tithes the members were giving. And again, remember I said the church owned vast real estate. Well, a lot of those buildings were rented out to merchants or to office, whatever. And the rent on those real estate holdings was siphoned off and sent to Rome. I mean, the wealth was just, it was huge. So the clergy, like I say, they had money coming in from all directions. They lived lavish lifestyles, and if a civil government tried to file charges against some of this goings on for malfeasance, in other words, the local government got put out with all these taxes and all this money that was being taken out of their domain and sent to Rome, and they pressed charges. This is malfeasance in office. They had no standing. That's only decided by the church court. Not civil courts have no jurisdiction whatsoever over that. They just kept sending the money out. So, again, we can't imagine the wealth where a church has 50% of the money in France and Germany, or 20% of the real estate in England, but they did. And then you had another problem, and that's, I can't remember the exact year, but it became a church dogma that the clergy had to be celibate. All right, couldn't be married. I think it was officially maybe in the early 1200s, but don't quote me on that. But it was by this time a official doctrine. And in some areas of Europe, especially Germany and the Netherlands, it's estimated that a quarter to a third of the priests, well, let's call them mistresses, kept mistresses, concubines, common law wives, all right, had children, but they're technically unmarried, so they're not violating the celibacy rule, according to them. Now, how corrupt, all right? But if they removed them for their immorality, well, they thought, man, we're going to be short 25 to 30% of priests that we need. So they decided, we'll just institute a concubinage fee. You priests that have concubines pay the fee, you're good to go. So they paid up, kept their lovers, their mistresses, and went right on. And of course, all the sacraments the priest administered in the church, they ruled that wasn't stained and tainted by the fact they lived immoral lives. They were just acting in the auspices of Christ, the head of the church, and it was through him that things were all hunky-dory and sanctified. So an evil priest could administer baptism to your infant or do the Mass and do the Eucharist, okay? No problem. But they were immoral, and everybody knew it.
Even though not necessarily talking about the Catholic Church, in 1 Timothy chapter 4,
Read it, please.
here Paul said to Timothy, there's going to be changes promoting in the church, and there would be those who would give heed to those teachings, and they would be forbidding to marry and commanding to abstain from meats, and that God created to receive with thanksgiving. Every creature of God is good, and nothing is to be refused. So there would be some changes made.
Yeah.
They prophesied that's going to happen, and they just accept it.
Yeah. Well,
Utilize the ignorance of the people. The people just depended on the church. Say, this is God.
that was bell number 2. Now think about this till Wednesday. The Catholic Church kept the scriptures in Latin. They didn't allow it to be translated into English, which was Old English, or to French, or to Spanish, or to German, or to all these. They kept the church services in Latin. Nobody had a copy of the Bible. It would have been in Latin, and they couldn't have read it, and they were unlearned and illiterate people anyway. So the church kept it all tamped down. Nobody knew that verse, Jerry. The priests weren't teaching it. All right? And that's kind of what blows the lid off of all this for the Reformation. It's when the scripture started being translated into the vulgar, it's called vulgar, your language. You can read it for yourself. And education was at the end of the Middle Ages, a lot of universities. And folks, when people get educated, guess what they do? They start thinking for themselves. And that's really reaction to all this corruption and people becoming more educated and thinking for themselves is what led to the Protestant Reformation. And we'll end there and start, Lord willing, Wednesday night with the Papal Schism.